Hello, my name is Paul Simon from Suffolk Chamber of Commerce, and I'm delighted to have with me Tim Passmore, Police and Crime Commissioner for Suffolk. Tim, when the idea of police commissioners was envisaged well over a decade ago, one of the arguments for the concept was that it would give greater devolved powers to local people to have a voice in terms of how policing was managed and operated. And yet we've seen, haven't we, you've seen for the last 11 years in post that you're hot wired to the Home Office institutionally and financially. How frustrating has your period in office to date been, and have you ever considered resigning?
No, I've never considered resigning because I don't believe that adopting the empty chair policy is the right one. To answer your question, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting
Pleasure.
me. Always like to have good discussions with the Chamber. It's really, really important for the whole of Suffolk, this. But yeah, of course there's a degree of frustration because I'm a Suffolk person all my life so far, and I do think the idea of devolving powers locally is a very good one. And when police commissioners were, I suppose, came into being back in 2012, I thought this was a golden opportunity to actually help Suffolk progress and customise what we need to do here. I've always said, Paul, that if you look at the policing needs and crime prevention needs and looking after victims in places like Liverpool or Manchester or London, it's never going to be the same as in Suffolk. Suffolk is a unique county. In my slightly vast opinion, it is the best county in the whole country.
Amen.
And we have huge potential, which I think is not tapped properly. And I also think that people need to understand that dealing with crime, preventing crime, having good policing really does help economic development, albeit indirectly. We all know if you get economic depressions or lack of opportunity, you tend to have a correlation between lack of opportunity and high levels of crime, antisocial behaviour, addiction and abuse.
You've always been a strong advocate of the business, the pro-business impact of good policing.
Yes.
But what we've seen in the last 10 years, through a lack of fair funding from the Home Office, is that the constabulary for which you are responsible has in effect had one hand tied behind its back. How do you make the Home Office listen and treat Suffolk in line with neighbouring authorities such as Norfolk and give fairer funding to allow your officers to create a safer environment for business people to trade in?
Well, first of all, I do think the constabulary does do a very good job, but of course, as in any organisation, there's always room for improvement and doing things better. As regards funding, this is one of my huge frustrations with the Home Office. Their obdurate and negative approach to this is unacceptable. The reality is we are still waiting to see their draft funding formula revision proposals. They tell me that they've had this, and I've spoken to ministers, all our MPs. We've spoken at chamber meetings.
Absolutely. That
coalition of the willing is absolutely crucial. And it remains the case that Suffolk is the fourth lowest funded force per resident, including council tax, and roughly half the money comes from the Home Office in the country. What they're doing in the Home Office and why there is this prevarication and further delay, I have absolutely no idea. Ministers have told me the draft is nearly complete. Well, I heard that 3 years ago. So could you just buck up and get on with it?
Do you, again, amen to that. I mean, do you think the situation would change if there was a change in administration? Or is this something institutionalised within the Home Office itself?
Well, no, that's a really interesting. I don't think it will change because at the moment, of course, the country is very, very short of money, which is why we've got to get the economy going. I'd have thought that's pretty obvious to anybody. But you've got to remember this rather strange funding formula, I think, was first put in place under previous governments, I think going back to Tony Blair's time. We then had an opportunity with the coalition government involving the Liberal Democrats. Nothing was done. Now we've had Conservatives on their own for some of the years, albeit in coalition with the Ulster Unionists for some time. You know, we need the results of this. What's the point of having a review if you don't actually publish it? I suspect it might be controversial, and I suspect one of the difficulties is if you look at Suffolk, our funding per resident in the previous financial year was just under 190 quid per resident. That's all the funding. And you go up to places like London, I know it's different, but it's about 340, 350 per resident. And the metropolitan areas actually do far better than us. They've got a smaller geographic area to cover. And I do wonder, with all this talk about equality and diversity, Has the Home Office done an equality impact assessment? I bet they haven't, and if they have, they've kept it very quiet.
It sounds like there's an anti-rural
Yes.
tendency within the Home Office. But given that, you've been forced to increase the police precept on the council tax close to the limit allowed by the government for a number of years now, including the proposal this year for a smidgen's worth away from 5%. At the same time, I couldn't help but notice, and I was surprised, that your team behind you is quite large. I mean, I didn't know, for example, that you have a chief executive, you have a number of admin assistants, you have a number of compliance and legal officers. Is there any scope for you to cut down the size of the Commissioner's team, which many people, I think, will be surprised is quite large?
Well, you may think it's quite large here. It's about the smallest in the whole country, actually. And when I was first elected back in 2012, the total cost of employing the police authority and the team to look after them was over £1.3 million of taxpayers' money. The current year, the budget for us, including my allowance, is actually £938,000.
So it's come down?
So it's come down.
Okay.
Can you find another organisation that's actually cut its budget to that extent? Probably not. But I do want to make one other comment. One of the issues that came up, I think about 2 years after I was first elected, we then became responsible for commissioning work for victims. We didn't have that before. We now get a 3-year budget from the Ministry of Justice for looking after victims. And we do a lot of work with the voluntary sector, charitable sector, which is absolutely fundamental to what we do. So we're always looking at cost pressures. I have to, the standards in public life. The chief executive is also the monitoring officer. We used to have a deputy chief executive. We do not. Okay. Many PCCs have deputy PCCs.
You've swung the axe, and well done to you. And I know you're continuing to look at efficiencies. I think your proposals for the next few years is just over £5 million worth of cuts.
Yeah.
Now, you've been a great advocate for opening up the procurement processes under which the constabulary operates. And you and I have discussed it personally a number of times. There isn't much leeway for local SMEs to pitch for tenders and win tenders. Given that, if you're institutionalising even more cuts, doesn't that sort of basically lock out smaller businesses in the county from ever winning any business from the constabulary in Suffolk?
If it were just down to me, the answer is a resounding no. Of course it doesn't cut them out, because small SMEs are the lifeblood of our economy. And it's really, really important that we look at this for procurement. And my view is we should be looking at the social value. Now, this is not some wet, soppy approach and so on. This is actually, if we spend taxpayers' money in our local economy and it creates more employment and more demand, we all benefit. So indirectly, police procurement can help. Now, only 20% of our budget in the current year of £168.4 million is actually spent on goods and services. We are making progress. There's a very good example in partnership with the Mildenhall Hub, which is a £40 million project that was completed 2 or 3 years ago, involving many public sector bodies. I actually put my foot down and said that needs to go to a local firm. It did. I went to Carter's, and the other thing I was really pleased about, they employed 10 youngsters who were unemployed, gave them an apprenticeship, and they've now got full-time jobs. It is about time the public sector woke up, looked at this seriously instead of talking about it, and actually did something about it. Actions speak louder than words, and I think we've got huge scope to do a lot more here in Suffolk, joining together with public sector bodies, and we need to do that. I would love to have the opportunity to set up a new procurement hub involving people like yourselves and others. What can we really, really do to make a difference? I believe the public expenditure in Suffolk must be getting on for around £10 billion a year. Well, of 20% of that clearly is £2 billion. Your maths is probably better than mine. But if we put that level of social value up and you increased the amount going to Suffolk business by just 10%, that's another £200 million into Suffolk economy. What is it that people don't understand about that?
Now, it's very clear, Tim, and you've always been such a strong advocate for the relationship between local businesses and the public sector, and the importance of the circular economy, both in terms of keeping and retaining wealth and growing wealth within the county, but also the kind of social implications of that. Can I turn briefly to some sort of frontline challenges that the constabulary are grappling with now. And one in particular that is a cause of concern here, but I think more generally, is the response rates to retail crime. Yes. I mean, I think it's fair to say that many retailers feel abandoned by the police, both in terms of reports of antisocial behaviour, but also systemic and industrial scale shoplifting.
Yeah.
Around here, I've spoken to a number of the retailers, independents and those in chains, and they say we hardly ever bother contacting the police when there's a shoplifting incident, because if we get a response, it's quite tardy and it doesn't result in any kind of action. I know you're aware of this. Yes. What plans have you got to reassure retailers that they haven't been abandoned in the longer term?
Retailing is very, very important, and of course shoplifting, it's theft. It's against the law, and I'm not one of these people who thinks you can be ambivalent and just have a hierarchy of different crimes. That counts for small business in particular just as much as major crimes, international fraud. So I'm absolutely on the side of business. What I would ask though, if you don't feel you're getting a satisfactory response, that's part of the role as a police and crime commissioner, to represent the public view and hold the constabulary to account. If people don't report it, and if they're not satisfied, for goodness sake, please get in touch with our office, nag me, give me a hard time. That is part of the role, and I promise I will take it forward. It's really, really important to do that. So what are we doing? Well, as it happens, only last week I was over at Newmarket talking to the co-op. I'm actually going to visit some retailers this week with Terry Baxter from Ipswich Central. I've been up to Lowestoft to talk to people up there on 2 occasions, including the Business Improvement District there. And I think in February we've got an appointment coming up with the bid with Mark Cordell over at Bury. I need to hear people's views, sure, and then I shall be taking them into account. Then we will be looking at what can be done to prevent shoplifting. I know there's an argument from the constabulary, well, stores can do more. Okay, but that may be the case, but let's work together. But please, you have got to report it. I can't have a go at the Home Office if we don't have crime reporting, and that's all crime, because it is a serious issue. And why should people who run their businesses legitimately be undercut by people stealing things or doing things under the counter? It's not acceptable. We live in an ordered, tolerant society where we do not and should not ever tolerate crime.
Strong messaging. So from old school theft to new school theft, cybercrime, which again I know has been an issue that you've been concerned about. Yes. How do you evaluate the readiness and the relationship between the sort of cyber expert teams across the constabularies, because I appreciate it's a pooled resourcing, and local businesses? What more can be done?
Well, I think it is about good engagement. When particular situations arise, then we need to hear about them. Now, I'm not an expert in IT or cybercrime, but what I do know is the number of crimes committed online or cyber-dependent crime is going through the roof, particularly fraud, identity theft, and so on. Yep. And I think nationally we're way behind the curve on fraud, and it's got to be addressed. It's a serious, serious issue. There was a recent report from the police inspectorate, time for action. Now, I'm following that up with the constabulary because we need to deal with this. It requires a lot of expertise. If there's anything that business can do to help, we do have volunteers, for example, in our cyber unit. I've been criticised in the past, by the way, for just being over-focused on putting money into the cyber unit. Well, I disagree with that, and I'm quite happy to stand on that track record. If we don't put resources into dealing with these new forms of crime in all their different manifestations, we've got a problem. And it's far better to be upfront and prevent it rather than try and cure it.
And how much of the 5% precept increase will go to funding?
I couldn't give you an exact figure on that, because this year the 5% precept is more or less maintaining service levels as they are, because the government funding has only got up by 2.1%. We've got £1.3 million savings programme for this year. And one of the reasons we are in a slightly difficult position, and why I need to ask for the increase in the council tax, is the 7% pay award given to staff and police officers during the current financial year was not fully financed. We did get extra money from the government, and that will be continuing to next year. It is fully deserved. Police officers, quite rightly, don't go on strike. I don't think any emergency service should be allowed to go on strike, but you need some kind of arbitration. In my view, I'm not an HR expert, coming down on one side or the other, I think there'd be a meeting of minds and that would help. But I have to have a balanced budget. We don't want to get into financial difficulty. And the other thing, Paul, could I just say, one of the things about this role, you do need to think long term. First 2 years I think I was in office, we actually did freeze the council tax. And here's another go at the Home Office, but probably the Treasury. What we call legacy grants, which goes to the freeze grant and so on, where I did exactly as the government asked. The money we got, and I think it totals about 1.6 million quid, has not been increased at all in line with the council tax. So you're almost being penalised. So doing what the government of the day, that was the Liberal Conservative coalition back in 2012, asked, and yet those who put the council tax up more are getting more money. That cannot be right, and it needs to change. The Treasury needs to wake up.
And looking at another signature initiative of yours, I think from the very early days when you were in post, which was addressing the scourge of domestic violence. And I know you've allocated significant funds to support victims and support sort of families and likewise. But what is the role of business, do you think, in terms of maybe spotting signs of domestic violence being experienced by members of their staff? Is there more that the constabulary can do with the business community to sort of provide that kind of early warning? And therefore the kind of interventions which you've actually looked to instigate throughout the county?
Now, I think it's a really serious issue, this. It's the biggest crime category we have.
Is it? Yeah. Really?
Over 10,000 cases on average over the last 3 years have been reported, and we know it's underreported. And the reason I'm particularly concerned about this, from an individual point of view, I can't think of anything worse than having to live with that cloud hanging over you. You know, your Englishman's home is his castle. Should be for anybody, actually. And if this goes on and you don't have a good home life and you're worried about things like this, intimidation, coercive control, extreme violence, sadly on a few cases, you've got a real problem. The other thing I'm particularly concerned about, the damaging effect that has on children who witness this. Is it any wonder that children brought up in that atmosphere become the repeat offenders or become offenders as they grow older and reach the age of adult?
So what can employers do? What role does the business community have?
So the other issue I think is important. If you've got someone like that, they're never going to be as in that position with abuse and violence at home. Are they ever going to be as productive as they should be? No. And that's why all businesses need to look at this very carefully, have a duty of care, get to know people. Not everything can be done online these days, and I do think face-to-face meetings are important. That social side, to understand what makes people tick and how they behave and what difficulties, you can tell by looking at people's body language sometimes. Many are others are more open and some are less open than others. So having that opportunity to discuss these things and put it out in the open is important. We do have a big network now in Suffolk, led by the County Council of Domestic Abuse Champions. I think there's somewhere around 700 or 800. Businesses are encouraged to have somebody somewhere in their organisation, or more if it's a big organisation, to have that ability to discuss and bring it out. Help is available. That's one of the things we've put a huge amount of public money in to supporting charities like Lighthouse, Leeway, Compassion, Bury Women's Aid and so on, and I wish we could do more. And by the way, just quickly one on procurement there, that Suffolk pound note, that pound coin, for domestic, for charities, we try to keep every single penny of that just with local based charities. So that procurement of sorts, keep that Suffolk taxpayers' money in Suffolk and then we all benefit.
Excellent. And then finally, I know you're standing again, but let's not second guess the outcome. Come May, what would you say in the last 10 years has been your greatest achievement, the one that you're personally most proud of as commissioners, and what would be your one key aim should you be elected to another four-year term?
Difficult to pick on one, but certainly we were just talking about domestic abuse and violence because that affects the whole economy. I also think alongside that is getting policing generally to recognise good policing, keeping crime levels low, does help the economy develop. And I think other things you can do that do help. I suppose if you look at our rural policing team, which helps advise many people, that's important. The rural economy counts. People in rural areas pay their taxes and dues like everybody else, and it is not all about London, Manchester and Birmingham. I'm fed up with hearing about that. So this is about putting Suffolk first. And I've tried to the best of my ability to do that. There are many other things that we could go on.
One's enough, and then one big ambition
Looking
for the next
forward,
4 years.
I think if you look at the big demand on policing, we have not got it right in the criminal justice system as a whole, but specifically, what are we going to do to rehabilitate offenders so you don't get this revolving door of short sentencing? It costs the taxpayer a fortune. We've got huge labour shortages. Let's get a proper framework together to help Suffolk people who've lost their way, been in trouble, get them employed and being productive members of society. In the past, in my farming days, I have employed people from those backgrounds. I know it works, and I would love to have the opportunity to do that. I've already spoken to Declan Moore, the governor at Norwich Prison. Many Suffolk inmates actually are housed up in Norwich, and I think we've got some exciting schemes we could do that to move forward. And that would involve the Chamber, various business organisations, because if we do that together, that power of collaboration, I think could make one heck of a difference, and we need to get on with it.
And the Chamber would certainly be up for that. In fact, we're very much aware that a number of our members, I'll name check Green King, already doing extraordinarily large amount in terms of bringing ex-offenders onto the payroll, giving them the kind of additional support they might need for a time. And actually, I think by and large, their experience has been incredibly positive.
Now, and I think that's really important. You know, there are too many people in society who do not recognise that good business is a force for good, and we all benefit. That's where the money is earned to pay for public services and grow on a tree or kept in some old tin round the back, as we say in Suffolk. It's important, policing, we all embrace the need for business to thrive and prosper. If we don't do that, we all lose. And that's why I'm absolutely determined, if I do get re-elected, to make sure that continues to put business at the central focus of what we're trying to do, then we'll all benefit. And that prosperity means you should in time get less issues regarding addiction, antisocial behaviour, violent crime and other forms of crime. So let's do it together and then we'll succeed.
Tim Passmore, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Paul. A pleasure.